Make sure that this is working. Test this to make sure that we've got. It's working. Good deal. Okay. All right. So today we, according to the schedule, need to talk about the meaning and value of work. And one of the previous editions of the textbook that we use in this class talked about the case of Pat Tillman. Most of you don't remember this because it's ancient history and you probably or maybe weren't even born at the time, or if you were really, really young. After 9/11, a lot of people joined the military. And I had several students in my class that did this, that joined the US Army or Navy or Air Force or Marines and went off to fight in Afghanistan after we had been attacked. I mean, I had probably 5 of my students drop out of class that semester and join the military. Pat Tillman did this. He was an NFL player for the Cardinals, and he went to the United States Army and ultimately gave the ultimate sacrifice of his life in a combat zone. He was an actual combat soldier and actually died. Why would somebody do that? Why would they give their life when they have a multi-million-dollar, now at that time it was still a lot of money. I mean, the contracts that they get today are just absolutely insane. And the contracts that they may get post playing in the NFL. I think I was watching football with my father over the weekend, and the announcers and what they're paid, who are all former football players, are millions and millions of dollars. Why would you forego that kind of lucrative career to be an enlisted person in the United States Army and risk going and losing your life? Yeah.
I think it's because, like, without that idea of freedom and liberty that America has, like, there's no point in playing football and having these millions of dollars, because, like, watching your country go through something so horrendous from another country, like, it's that, like, patriotism and that idea of, like, the freedom and liberty to, like, go to war. And, like, who cares about this $1 million if this happens again? It could be worse. We could lose that liberty and freedom, you know?
Right. I think a lot of people you all are way too young to remember 9/11. Is there anybody in here who remembers you actually remember 9/11? Most people are like, at this point, that's, really, really ancient history for most of my students.
I was like 3 weeks old.
I remember 9/11 clearly. I was teaching a class here at UCO. At the time, I wasn't a marketer, I was a political scientist, and I was teaching a class over in the communication building. And I walked in that morning, it was a 7 a.m. class. And my class was in an auditorium over there, and they had television monitors out in the hallway. And I walked in, and there was the news, and I went into my classroom and I said, I think that something major's happened, and it's probably more important to you to go watch the news today than it is to talk about the presidency or wherever it was that we were at that point in our discussion. And shortly thereafter, they closed everything down. And the skies closed down. America sort of came to a halt. And I think your point is that, yeah, this is what will you even have, the ability to make this kind of money if our very existence is threatened? I mean, it's an existential threat to, our nation. Now that's an argument sort of ad absurdum, isn't it? I mean, what are the chances that this, you know, very underdeveloped country could destroy the United States.
And I also feel like from that standpoint too, like, you know, it was the first real like terrorist attack that like a lot of people at that time had even seen in America. And I like feel like the other one would be like Pearl Harbor, so that was so much further away. So like going from that, and then like a lot of people, I feel like they were kids during the Vietnam War even, and so like for them, like they kind of grew up on that idea of like how important it is, like our country and all those freedoms and liberties that we have. So like the idea of that smaller country like destroying America is like not real, like it wouldn't really happen, but I feel like just seeing like this is a threat, like this genuinely happened, like it totally just like inspired so many people to.
You get 2 ducks, by the way, since you answered a whole
I
bunch.
feel like because
Go
of
ahead. You had 1 second. You need to grab a duck, and then you can go. Go ahead.
well, I was just looking at like it was the first tragedy like that was broadcast to such a wide like amount of people. So like it wasn't just something that like, oh, this is a terrible thing that's happened and it's motivated me. Like no, I've seen it happen.
Mhm.
And so there was some aspect of it was much more real. Like using the example of like Pearl Harbor,
Right.
like there wasn't the broadcasting of it,
TV,
and like
yeah.
and so you don't get up and you don't go into the class at 7 a.m. and see it on the TV and see it happen.
Yeah.
It was something that was probably a lot more real. So that whether or not the realistic like fear of this country coming in and destroying America, I saw it happen, and it's like so that would be I think more of a motivating
Like
factor
the
than even
fuel to
Yeah.
like get you out there, yeah.
You get a duck. Go ahead. What were you?
Well, specifically for Pat Tillman, it might have been a moral standpoint. He could have been sitting there like, why am I gonna let these other people lay their life down and I'm just gonna sit at home and be comfortable? I need to go put my life down too to protect our country. I don't want it to get attacked like this. It's not right.
Somebody else said some. What were you?
I also think if going on 9/11, it wasn't just something that affected our country. It marked a day for just like what you mentioned. I think this is the second time you've actually mentioned 9/11, and I just kind of think that speaks on how important it is to you for you to be able to remember that day like it was just yesterday. But I know my mom thinks it was just like yesterday, and everyone else does too. So I don't think it only opened up our minds to what could happen to us, but to other countries too, who see us as an ally, like, oh crap, this could happen to us too.
Right.
So just kind of breaching that relationship that we could all be in danger based on what happened to us.
Yeah, I think there are several moments, and I remember as a child, my mother describing in detail, remembering exactly where she was and what she was doing the day they came into her classroom and announced that President Kennedy had been shot. I mean, there are these moments in history that are, if you lived through them, are emblazoned on your mind and you will never forget those moments ever. The first moment for me that I remember that was like that was when the space shuttle blew up. I mean, I was so interested in aviation and space and the space program. There was a movie that came out when I was a young kid called Space Camp, about these kids that get to go, to it's a fictionalization that NASA hosts this camp, and they get to go and train just like astronauts. And that was so interesting to those of us who grew up in an era in which space exploration was such a huge deal
It was so fresh.
and
yeah.
such a part of our cultural zeitgeist and part of our optimism about the future of science and where we were headed in the world. And then the space station, after they retired the shuttle program, sort of went through a period where it was kind of on a back burner and we didn't think about it as much. But the shuttle blowing up was one of those moments where you just absolutely remembered where you were and what you were doing. The next one came when the Oklahoma City bombing. I was working for an attorney at the time. I was not an attorney yet. I was working in a law office, aspiring to be an attorney. And we were going to go file a bankruptcy that day, which meant that we were going down to the federal courthouse in Oklahoma City, and we were headed right down there. And I remember being I lived in an old home at the time. I still live in an old home in Guthrie, and didn't have a shower, had a bath tub. And I remember watching the water at that moment ripple like had been an earthquake. That's how far the blast could be felt. And then getting out and hearing about the Oklahoma City bomb. And obviously our plans changed. It was a day that you didn't forget. And if you lived in Oklahoma at the time, you knew people if you lived in the Oklahoma City area, you knew people. I had one of the people that I was in college with, his wife worked at the Water Resources Board, was pregnant and was in that building when the blast went off. I mean, you remember these things, they're sort of seared into your memory. And so they become enormously important motivating factors for a lot of us in our careers and the things that we choose to do.
I mean, I'm only 21, and I think the only
Get it
moment
done,
I've
by the
had
way,
like
before
that.
you forget.
Oh, cool, thank you. I think the only moment for me that I can really think of is probably whenever COVID hit, and I mean, I was a sophomore in high school, and them saying, "Hey, you can't go back to school," and I was
Right.
like, "No way!" And then you Google it, and it's everywhere.
Right, yeah, and then your life changed.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, we went from being a very social, I mean, one of the things that's really hard for Oklahomans, because we are a really tactile people.
Mhm.
We are huggers. I've been a politician, since I was 25 years old, was the first time I won elective office. And part of being a politician in Oklahoma is going to county fairs and 89er day rodeos, and you see your local citizens and you hug them. I mean, we went from being this society that is very sort of warm, I think, compared to other places. That's part of our culture in Oklahoma that's different than other places. New Yorkers in New York City are not big huggers the way we are in Oklahoma. Now, if you get into upstate New York, you'll find that there's more of that. When my brother lived in Saratoga Springs, but in New York City, people are focused on getting through the day in a mass, chaos kind of environment that we just don't understand in Oklahoma at all. It's just completely antithetical to sort of our way of thinking. The massive amounts of people that you have to get through just to get anywhere. And I've known people who have moved here, for example, that moved here from the East Coast in New York City. And I was like, why would you move here? And they're like, do you know how frustrating it is to be able to see where you're going and know that you're 2 hours away? Like literally be in a cab and be able to see where you're going down the street, which is less than a mile. You can see the building and it's like probably 2 hours away. And it's raining outside and you can't, so it's not like, getting out and hoofing it is not necessarily an option. I mean, it's just totally different than what we experience here in Oklahoma. And so, these moments do make a huge difference, and they change a lot of people in terms of what they're willing to do. I think a lot of people, as a result of COVID, have thought about the medical profession. They've been motivated to go into the medical profession because it's, a way that you can serve your fellow man. And actually, nursing is a good career. I tell students, we have the only program on campus that can say all of our majors and minors get jobs, and that's professional selling. Nursing can say all of their majors get jobs, but they don't have a minor, so they can't claim that. All of our majors and minors get jobs in professional sales. And so it's one of those things that I think that you should consider. But nursing is a good career, and you can make good money. And it's one of those things that, I think there were a lot of people that thought about careers in medical field because they saw a need to help. There are also a lot of people who became terrified of going into the medical field because there was so much hype about how you could die. So what makes these kinds of careers really, really great? It's not money. Because obviously if you're in it for the money solely, you wouldn't leave a multi-million-dollar contract and the ability to, after that contract is over, go into the media and announce. And Pat Tillman would have been somebody who could have done that probably, right? He has the sort of look for television. Tom Brady has parlayed his NFL experience into, what is his contract in announcing for, is it Fox that he has? I think a contract
Fox
with
Sports.
Fox Sports.
I think.
It's $200 million this year for announcing football games. So it's obviously not just the money. What makes a job a great job?
Meaning?
What kind of meaning?
Well, it
Playing
depends.
football there's a lot of meaning in football. We obviously
Trying
attach
to
a huge
accomplish a
amount.
goal with a team, right, that's the meaning, trying to get to the championship in football,
Yeah.
but it just depends on the job.
Your love for it, kind of like your passion for that job. Like it doesn't matter exactly what job it is, but like if someone just wants to do it, like they just like doing it, then that's a meaningful job to them.
Okay. And we tell, one of the things that when I do this lecture, I oftentimes tell students, we have a mythology in this country, and that is that you can be whatever you want to be. We tell students that, and I'm not sure that's true. But we look at people like Barack Obama and we say, if he can become president of the United States, you can become president of the United States. And I can guarantee you that as much as I would like to be president of the United States, that's not going to happen for me. I have peaked at vice mayor of the city of Guthrie, right? I'm not going to become president of the United States. As brilliant as I think that I am, it's just, there's just, the odds of that happening are just very, very small. So even if we think about Pat Tillman, the odds of getting to where he was at in the NFL are very, very small. And then even the odds of staying there become pretty small. It's amazing how many people wash out. Tom Brady had, and I generally don't like Tom Brady because I'm convinced he cheated by deflating footballs. And the culture at the Patriots, I think, was absolutely, sort of like not great. It was a win at all cost kind of mentality. This is war kind of environment, I think, that they promoted there. And so we tell people, follow your passion and you'll be successful. And I think I've said this before when I was talking about one of my constituents who, when Guthrie actually used to run the waste disposal pickup, when those were actually city employees, one of those employees was one of my constituents. He lived in my ward and I knew him. And I don't know anybody who says I want to be a trash man, right? That's not somebody's goal. What Mike Rowe says, though, is that maybe we shouldn't tell people to follow their passion, because your passion may lead you to going broke. If you want to get a degree in opera, what are the odds of you being wildly successful?
Pretty low.
Pretty low. And even if you are really successful at this, if your love is opera, how many people go to the opera? I came back from Santa Fe. That's where my dad lives, yesterday. And I got stuck there. I was supposed to be back on Sunday, and because of weather, I got trapped in Santa Fe and had to come back yesterday. So the reason I mentioned Santa Fe is Santa Fe has an opera that plays in the summer. It's a very famous opera. How many of you in this, I've been to the Santa Fe Opera as a child. I was drugged there by my parents because that's what cultured people did. How many of you have been to an opera? 3 of you? 4?
School
Did you
field
enjoy it?
It was all right.
I think it lasted too long.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a school field trip. We got to goof off a little bit.
okay. I mean, you're talking about an incredibly small segment of even the theater going crowd. Guthrie used to have a full-time professional theater company. The only full-time, year-round, paid company in the state of Oklahoma was in Guthrie. It's called the Pollard Theater. It's still there. They don't have a full-time professional. I mean, they had a cast that was paid full-time of something like when I was in high school and my mother was on city council and she sat on the board of directors of the Pollard Theater, which was the Guthrie Arts and Humanities Council board that managed it. They had 13 full-time employees that they paid. They had a director, an artistic director, they had all of these actors, and they were paid full-time employees of the Guthrie Arts and Humanities Council. That's no longer the case. It's basically become community theater. You know, I mean, they don't have, they hire cast not on salary to maintain a permanent company. It's by show now. And the number of shows, they used to produce 11 shows a year, 1 a month. And I can't remember what month they took off as like kind of a transition month to get ready for the new season, but that, they don't do that anymore. So if you're thinking about theater, then opera is an even smaller subset of that theater. What are the odds of you becoming really, really successful? So Mike Rowe, who did the Dirty Jobs, said, we tell people that they should follow their passion. And maybe that's a mistake because following your passion can lead you to going broke. It's one of the reasons that you all are probably in a business class and sitting here yapping at me. I take teams to competition, and one year when we went to competition in New Orleans, I took our students to a very famous plantation outside of New Orleans as part of their sort of reward for participating in the competition. It's called the Laurel Plantation. It's a Creole plantation. And they have these interpretive guides, and I was asking the guide there, just sort of out of curiosity, I was like, well, how did you get this job? What made you want to be a guide at a plantation? And they said, well, I have a master's in history, in interpretive history, and so this was like my ideal job. And I just, because I'm a business professor, am interested, I'm like, do you mind me asking what your salary is here? And they said something like $21,000 a year. And they had a master's degree in history from Louisiana State University. And they were making $21,000 a year. And I'm like, and I turned to my students and I'm like, and that's why you're sales students, right? Not a lot of our students started out saying they wanted to be salesmen. In fact, the vast majority of business students say, I want to get a degree in business, but I don't want to go into sales, not realizing that their first job is probably going to be selling. Almost everybody's first job is selling, whether you like it or not. If for no other reason than you're going to have to sell yourself, and that's going to be important. So we tell people to follow their passion. So how do we make these jobs that maybe aren't your passion? I don't think a lot of students, when they start out in college, even think of marketing as being, I mean, I don't know a lot of students that start out saying, I want to be a marketer. It's something that they learn about through the course of maybe going into, they know they want to get a business degree, so maybe they start out as a general business major and they take a marketing class, their principles of marketing class, and something in that class, one of our professors who teaches the principles, I'm going to teach principles of marketing, I'm teaching it this semester as well, for the first time in a long time, and I'm gonna teach it in the spring again. And maybe something sparks it in that, but a lot of our students start out, they say they want to be accountants, and then they get to cost accounting, and they decide that they don't want to be accountants anymore. And they decide that maybe marketing looks pretty good after they get to either intermediate or cost or something like that, and they decide that maybe that this is not a bad program. So how do we get people interested in these jobs that maybe they aren't passionate about, and how do we make those jobs ethical? So if we look at the sort of views of work, the traditional view of work is that it's a means to an end. It's something that we have to do and endure in order to make money and support our families, ourselves and our families. That's sort of the traditional view of work. It's a transactional sort of thing. With that comes an enormously sort of negative view of work. The 20th century, the late 19th century and early 20th century views of work focus on many of the human degradations that occurred as a result of work and industrialization. If you went back to this period in time, the Industrial Revolution in the United States and in Western Europe, what you saw massive amounts of people moving from the agricultural-based society to an industrial-based society where the jobs were no longer in growing things in the field and they were being transferred to cities. So we see the urbanization. And as a result of this urbanization, you have an enormous amount of social problems that develop because of this sort of inability to deal with the influx of people that are now moving to factories and what it means for society to have this structural transformation. And we've seen these structural transformations throughout history, right? So if we look back at sort of the historic record, the anthropological and archaeological record, man starts out as hunter-gatherers. And then there's a big shift at the point at which we become settled and become cultivators of the land, no longer just chasing things, but we cultivate the land and we domesticate animals. That's a huge shift in terms of technological advancements and the way man functions. And for most of human history, then we become sort of agricultural, rural, agrarian type people. And you grew what you could, eat and tried to make enough to sell some and have some left over. And that sort of feudal system gives way to a more egalitarian system in places like the United States, where land becomes more readily available and people can own their own land. And this is part of the American psyche to this day, is this idea of we want to own our own piece of land. That's not part of the psyche, by the way, of a lot of places in other parts of the world where land is more scarce and it's not as readily available. In the United States, because we're a big country, we just kept moving west and people would develop. So we have this ability of people to own their own land, farm the land, and that's the history of the state of Oklahoma, right? They gave away free land, the government opened it up for settlement, people came here and they farmed the land. And then as industrialization takes hold, we see a huge shift from rural to, because it no longer takes, an entire family to farm 40 acres. 40 acres is nothing anymore, right? That's not the way we farm anymore, is with a plow and a mule and all the kids going out and helping. We now do it with huge industrialized machines that are capable of farming hundreds of thousands of acres in relatively short periods of time. And so people start moving to the cities, and this creates an enormous amount of social disruption as we go from this sort of agricultural, everybody's living out in the country, to massive numbers of people living in the city. And you get the muckraking journalists of this era producing works like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which cataloged the depravities of the meat industry and what was going on in the slaughter yards and the meat processing. So we now have fewer and fewer people that are needed for the production of our food, and more people now needed in these cities. And the things that happen, children working in textile mills, for example, to support their family. And the problems and social problems that occurred with that transformation from rural and agricultural to industrial. You got a series of cases as a result of the railroad turntables that have profoundly influenced Anglo-American jurisprudence and the way we think about things, right? So as people move from the country to the city, you have more and more people living closely, and this creates a lot of problems with children and their families and things like, what are we going to do for, waste disposal, and how are we going to maintain a healthy, sort of safe environment? When everybody lives out in the country, it's not that big of a deal, and the population is small to sort of, everybody provides for themselves and sort of takes care of themselves. But now you've got families in the city, they're working in these textile factories. These textile factories are shipping things out long distance. We're now mass producing goods for a consumer market. And so how are those shipped? Well, they were shipped by railroad, right, at the beginning of the 20th century. How did railroads work? Well, you have this engine, it went one direction. Now they go two directions in the modern world, but it went one direction. When it got to the end of the line, you'd put it on a turntable and put it back on the track and send it the other way. So there are these things in cities. You can see them in San Francisco, remnants of these. The streetcars will get to the end of a line, and they'll put them on these turntables. They have a key, and they unlock it, and they put the streetcar on the turntable, and the whole thing pivots around and sends the streetcar down another direction. So you have these kids that are now playing around these railroads because they're fascinated by the equipment and things like that. They get on the turntables and they get hurt, right? Forever and ever and ever at Anglo-American jurisprudence, the rule was trespassers are owed no duty. And that begins to change. As children are getting hurt on these devices and it becomes evident that the railroad knows about it and they have the ability to control it, we start seeing a doctrine of attractive nuisance develop. And so now we go from a theory of trespassers are owed no duty to, well, maybe you owe a duty if you have a dangerous device that you bring onto your land and you know that it's attractive to children who might be, interested in playing on it, and they're getting hurt. This leads to the attractive nuisance doctrine now leads to things like, if you build a swimming pool on your land, historically, if you own land, you build a swimming pool and some kid drowned in the pool, well, trespassers were owed no duty. Now, as a result of this change in society, this structural change as everybody moves to the cities, we now have an attractive nuisance doctrine, which means what? If you have a swimming pool, you have to build a wall or a fence or some way of protecting that swimming pool, right? So during this time period, what we see, I'm not saying, I don't think that we want to maybe idolize the previous time period when people were out on the farm and earning a living by, plowing 40 acres and planting wheat and corn and things like that and selling what they could. I'm not sure that was a great lifestyle. But when we start getting lots of density in population and these social problems come to the forefront, they're not seen necessarily when we're all living out in the country. We start getting journalists who start highlighting these problems. And a lot of the views of work come from this sort of era of the early industrial revolution, where it's very transactional. It assumes a means to an end. It assumes that there is an enormously exploitive aspect of this thing that we all have to do by powerful people who have the companies and the means of production to using women and children and men in ways that are dehumanizing and harmful. And so you get a movement of organizing labor to fight a lot of these social ills, right? So that's the sort of view of work that emerges at the beginning of the 20th century, this sort of traditional classical view of a means to an end, a dehumanizing aspect to it, and a real negative view, right? In opposition to this, so if we have a thesis which is it's transactional, right? Once again, I wish people would not just leave these here and they would throw them away. That work is a means to an end. So transactional. And then we can have an antithesis, which is the human fulfillment model, which is this juxtaposition, which is that work is not just necessarily a means to an end or a transaction, it's also the place in which many of us can achieve an enormous amount of human potential. It can be creative. This is the opera star that I spoke so disparagingly of just a minute ago. I think I told you all that I wanted to be a country and western superstar, but I'm a tone deaf. I'm actually not a tone deaf flat baritone, but I'm not a very good singer. I can actually make it through. I mean, I love karaoke. If there's a karaoke machine within 25 miles of me, I'm gonna be there. I've got karaoke videos on my YouTube channel that you can watch. And my friends are always horrified by this, but I was not gonna be a country and western superstar, so I had to become a college professor to get an audience instead. And this is a way that I fulfill my creative desires. It's interesting to me to see how I can motivate you to take an interest in things like sales and marketing and ethics, and to watch progression of students from the beginning of a course to the end of a course and see where we end up in terms of whether or not that has some impact on your ethical ideology. And how do I do that? How do I motivate you? How do I express these ideas in ways that reach you and make sense to you? That's enormously creative, right? For me, at least. It may be horrifying and torture for you. It's not quite the jungle, right? I'm gonna tell you that. It's not quite the jungle, or, you know, Suds Turkel's book Work, where if you look at what he says about work in that book, it's a list of sort of depravity that he talks about in that work. He says it's every day it's battle between workers and management. It's about, you know, kicking the dog, and I mean, it's just this sort of negative list. But yet, on the other hand, it can be this really, really ideal place to work, right? In terms of what we see, in terms of how we value work. So what is the meaning of work? Well, I think one of the things, when we look at these two opposing views, this thesis, which is transactional and has sort of a negative connotation of work, versus the antithesis, which is the human fulfillment model, which we'll talk more about, we have to talk about types of work that we have, right? So in Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah and his co-authors, he talks about 3 different types of work that you can have. The lowest category is just a job. In a job, one's identity is sort of divorced from the activity that they perform in order to earn a living. And again, going back to my example of the trash collector in Guthrie, he was my constituent, and I think I mentioned this in this class before. If you asked him, you know, what he enjoyed and what he did, he would talk about fishing and hunting and spending time with family and going to the river and doing things like that. His identity was sort of divorced from the job that he performed that was very transactional, right? That's not why you are in this classroom and letting me talk to you about these things. What you want is a career. In a career, there is an enormous amount of congruence between the identity of the individual and the actions that they perform as part of earning a living. It's the reason that you are in college, because you want a career in professional sales or in marketing, as you know, somebody who develops social media. That's the big interest right now, is using social media and how to become social media influencers or things like that, using artificial intelligence to promote goods and services. We're offering a new seminar in the spring on artificial intelligence to help, you know, businesses grow and develop in marketing. And it's an incredible what you can do with AI. How many of you have done AI pictures of yourself? Anybody tried this? Nobody's gone and uploaded a picture of themselves and had an AI generated photo?
I think so. I think on TikTok they have that one where, like, I'm sure y'all have seen it. It's like a couple and they put like a filter on and they're like in Disney, or, like a Pixar. Yeah, that's what I think of. So yeah, I guess.
It's incredible what I mean. It's almost hard to tell. My sister-in-law did this with her youngest son, and what it came up with was, I mean, you can tell it's him, but I mean, it's like the best version of him that you can possibly, you know, and it looks real and it's incredible. So we've got the ability to do this. And so that's why most of you want a career in marketing or sales, because you want to have some congruence between your identity and the activity that you perform. You want meaningful work. You want to find something that provides you with something other than this is just how I get a paycheck. The highest level is a calling. And this is one in which very few people achieve a calling. There is no distinction between your identity and the work that you perform. And for me, this is the way I look at, you know, the professions that I've had. So I started out, my first profession is as a lawyer. And that really is a calling. Because as an attorney, you are bound by the rules of professional responsibility, which are a very thick sort of set of do's and don'ts laid out, modeled. It was developed by the American Bar Association, a model code, and almost every state has adopted that code. And so it has this very long list of things that you can and cannot do. If we look at it, let's see. Research. The Oklahoma rules of professional conduct are found in Appendix 3 of the statutes, and they govern, so they run from the, it's not important that you read these, but you see this, they run, for a lot of sections in Appendix 3A of the code, governing everything from your advocacy, transactions with persons who are not clients, law firms, your duty to manage your associates and other people who work in a firm. Not everybody who works in a law firm is an attorney. There are paralegals, there are accountants, what kinds of information they have, right? How do you maintain the confidentiality of that? And the reason that I point this out as being a calling is that as an attorney, I am subject to these rules 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, whether or not I am engaging in the practice of law. You could file a bar complaint against me, even if I'm not your lawyer, if you think that I violated one of these rules. And so it's a calling, because when you take the oath of office as an attorney, you're an attorney until you're either disbarred or you give it up. And it's a calling. What else is an example of a calling? Well, generally the priesthood is an example of a calling. There is no distinction between the identity of the priest and what he's doing for a living. If you grew up like I did in the Catholic faith, priests give up everything for their job. They live a monastic life that touches every part of what they do. It's a devotion to this thing. Most people are not going to have that level of commitment to their job, but they want something that's interesting and is fulfilling and provides things beyond just sort of, and this is why this PowerPoints are not working very well today, beyond just these transactional benefits, but not necessarily going to the level of being all consuming with who you are, right? So what is the value of work? Well, obviously, a lot of what we've talked about, and when we think about things like the jungle and Studs Terkel's work, text called Work, it's just looking at these instrumental things that you get out of work. And these are important. Wages, benefits that go along with it. What are some of the benefits that you all hope to have as part of your job? Well, it's health benefits, right? Retirement, leave. What else? Besides these.
Comfortable,
Okay.
like in the
Comfortable,
lifestyle that I
safe
want.
working environment.
Yeah.
You don't wanna work Again, if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century, they have these factories where children are working. They're dangerous places to work. You could get your hand cut off. So you want it to be comfortable.
Friends maybe out of it, or like, you know, the relationship they.
Okay, so you can build relationships with the people that you work with.
Good
You have
culture.
something in common with them.
Good culture.
A good culture. Those are all psychic goods, right? Satisfaction, self-worth, achievement, self-esteem, and happiness that we can get from work. So there's these transactional benefits, which are important, but they're not necessarily all consuming. And then there are the psychic benefits that we can get as well, right? Now, some of them, the instrumental can bleed over into psychic goods as well. If you are uncomfortable, most of you are probably in this class again and getting a degree in marketing because you want to have something that's called a career and you don't want to be out working in the heat. It's pretty miserable. It's going to be 90 degrees today and we're in the middle of October. We're October 22nd, not just the middle, we're sort of the end of October. And what's the temperature going to be today in Oklahoma City?
I think the high is 86, I think.
It's like 91
What?
today.
For
It's
the next 3 days.
It's like 91 today.
I thought we had a cold front.
That's summer-like weather.
That's crazy.
It's going to be hot here in Oklahoma. Working outside. Most of you want to be inside where it's, relative. I tell you, as students at UCO, you kind of have to dress because big buildings are notoriously difficult to heat and air, but it's a hell of a lot more comfortable in here than it's going to be outside today in Oklahoma, right? So you want a job where you have these creature comforts, heat and air that are part of safe working conditions in a pleasant environment, right? So having talked about both conventional views and the human fulfillment model, what is the synthesis of these? So if we have the transactional model or the conventional view, the human fulfillment model is the antithesis, what would be the synthesis view of work? Well, the synthesis is what we might call the liberal model of work. What does this model entail according to Norman Bowie? Well, we can't all have meaningful jobs. There are some jobs that are just necessary and we're going to have people that perform them. And they're not necessarily going to provide all of these psychic goods or psychological satisfaction. So what can we do? In recognizing that there are still going to have to be people, and again, Mike Rowe highlights this in Dirty Jobs, these people who do these jobs, and one of the things that he said about a lot of the people who did these jobs, almost all of them who own the companies actually started out working in those jobs. So the guy who rebuilt septic tanks and was a millionaire started out doing the job themselves and saw a company. And I don't think anybody says my dream job is to rebuild septic tanks. It's necessary. And you can make a lot of money at it. But I don't think anybody said, I yearn to do this. They saw a need and they fulfilled that need. There was another book that came out when I was in college, that was many, many years ago, called The Millionaire Next Door. And it was done by some scholars who wanted to find out what it was, how it was you became a millionaire next door. And so I think they went to Dallas, as I recall. I may have this wrong, but I think it was in Dallas, and they went to a hotel and they rented a big room in the hotel, and they had it catered, and they had all of the things that they thought wealthy people would want. They wanted these people to come in and talk to them and sit for in-depth interviews to figure out what it was that made them successful. And so they ordered things like champagne. And at the time, a big deal was caviar. I don't know if you all, how many of you have had caviar? If you've had sushi, you've probably had caviar in some of the sushi in some way, but that was a big thing as a result of shows like Dallas and Dynasty to serve caviar. I remember in one episode of Dynasty, the character played by Joan Collins, whose name was Alexis, is sitting there being served caviar and little crackers, and didn't that or toast bread or something like that. And at the time, caviar was something like, this was in the like late 80s, early 90s. Caviar was something like $500 an ounce. So it was really expensive. If you had real, like legit caviar, and that was seen as a big deal. And so they I remember in the book they talked about, they ordered caviar and all of these things that they thought that these people, and the average millionaire drove a Ford Taurus. They had never paid more at that point in time than something like $300 for a suit. This was their best going to church clothes. They lived in a ranch house, and their big interest was in saving rather than spending. That was the secret. And most of them had businesses that were things like Mike Rowe highlights and dirty jobs, like rebuilding septic tanks, owning one guy I think that they highlighted in that book that I recall owned a junkyard, a scrap metal and junkyard. They had never ridden in a limousine. They went through all of these like eye-opening things, and yet they were millionaires, right? They were just more focused on savings. They had fairly mundane jobs. So the liberal model of work says, look, not everyone is going to be able to have these great jobs where we achieve our creative potential. Some people are going to have to rebuild septic tanks, and you can make a lot of money at this, by the way, doing it. But how do you make that an ethical workplace? Well, the liberal model, the synthesis view, says it's about recognizing human autonomy and free choices, recognizing that people are going to have to do these things. Not everyone is going to have really meaningful work, but allowing them the dignity to make independent, free choices in a society, not being forced into it. We faced about 2 or 3 weeks ago the potential for a port workers' strike to occur. If this had happened, it could have been devastating for the economy. And it could have had a huge impact on our election. If the economy tanks, generally what happens to the party in power if the economy tanks?
They get fired.
They get fired, right? People have a tendency to fire presidents if the economy is bad. That's now, people think the economy is bad, but by most objective indicators, the economy is pretty good right now. Yeah, inflation is high. And that's not great. But what else is high right now? Employee wages. One of the reasons that you have inflation is because you have full employment. And not only do we have full employment, but for the first time in recent history, workers are actually able to demand more and more money. Historically, who had the power, one of the reasons that you have labor during this time period of the early 20th century, the reason that labor organized and organized labor popped up was because the workers were at a severe disadvantage to the company, right? The company had the means of production and they had most of the control, and they had, whole towns basically that were controlled, that were company towns, where they could really control workers' lives. Because the company owned your house and they owned the store that you shopped at. And so you have organized, because there is such a shortage of workers right now in the market, workers for the first time, without having an enormous amount of organizing and formal labor organizations, because labor organizations don't represent the vast majority of workers. Workers actually have a lot of power right now in the workforce. And so it's recognizing this ability to allow people to make free choices in the workplace, not being forced into things. And the reason I point out the worker strike is that if the economy tanks, one of the things, and they asked the President of the United States if he would do this, is they have the ability to basically, in the interest of national, safety, force the workers back to work. And they asked the Biden administration, if these workers go on strike, are you going to do that? Are you going to order them back to work? And remarkably, he said no. Even though if they had struck, it could have been, how many of you recognize like a couple of weeks ago that like toilet paper was all of a sudden scarce? And this was a completely irrational buying on the part of people. We have this memory from COVID of what happened when there were shortages, and all of a sudden people heard that there was the potential for a strike to occur and shortages to happen, and they went out and they like started hoarding toilet paper, which was kind of crazy, because what's one of the few things that's not going to be touched by a port workers' strike?
Toilet paper.
Toilet paper. Why is that?
That's manufactured in the
It's
United States.
Absolutely, you get a duck. Like, we don't import toilet paper. It's one of the things that's actually manufactured here in the US. The reason that we had a shortage of it during COVID was because US factories that manufactured toilet paper were shut down. And the factories that had excess supplies of toilet paper were places like UCO, where we couldn't go because and you would think that the manufacturers of commercial toilet, the stuff that they put in office buildings would be the same. It's not. And so there's the shortage because all of a sudden people are using huge amounts of toilet paper at home and not at work, where they spend the majority of their waking hours, and it led to a problem. But people ran out, and as a result, they heard the stock and they heard shortage, and they ran out and started hoarding toilet paper. And they're like, please don't do that. Don't hoard the toilet paper. It's not going to be a shortage in that because of dock worker strike. But that could have a major impact on the economy. And the President of the United States has the ability, in some instances, to force people back to work. So a liberal model would say things like, you shouldn't do that. You should allow people to have a choice in this matter. It should be a matter of free will. The will shouldn't be overborne by the choices that we have to make, right? What constitutes a rational choice and the ability to have a rational choice? One, that it's knowing. Two, that's a very low bar. You're conscious, you're awake, you know what's going on, that it's voluntary. And three, that it's informed. These are the three elements of being able to have autonomy. That that's pretty easy. That's an easy bar to satisfy this element of the test. Are you awake? Are you conscious? Do you know what your name is? Do you know what the date is? Do you know who the president of the United States is? Do you understand the questions that we're asking you, right? That's pretty easy bar. Voluntary. Well, this becomes more difficult, this element of the test. Is it voluntary? When I used to teach criminal law and procedure, there's all of these cases in criminal law and procedure that deal with whether or not a confession is voluntary. In the olden days, this happened. There were these items that everybody had in their home that were called phone books. You all have never seen these. They used to list everybody's number in a phone book. And there were these thicker parts of the phone book called the yellow pages where businesses advertised. And that's how you found, before there was Google, if you wanted to find a plumber, you went to the phone book and you looked up the number, right? Police departments would use these things. They would say, did you commit the crime? No, I didn't commit the crime. And they take a yellow pages and go whack right upside the head. Why? Doesn't leave a mark. And so you might get a confession out of somebody. Was it voluntary? After you've been hit with a phone book a few times, you might confess, right? Not voluntary. Informed. This is the toughest part. Do you understand the alternatives before you? If there's only one job in town, it's probably not going to meet this test. If the only job you're qualified in town is to work for the, septic company, it may not be a knowing, voluntary, and informed choice. And so we should focus on the ability to have these knowing, informed, and voluntary choices. Why do we worry about this as marketers? And why am I talking about this in a marketing ethics course? Well, the reason that we talk about this is because there's a recognition in marketing today that it's not just about marketing to external constituencies. I told you at the beginning of class that marketing is the only fully integrated function of the firm, meaning that marketers seek to add value across all aspects of the firm. And marketing is the only part of the firm that deals with both external and internal constituents. And so it's important as we try to maintain value across the firm that people have an idea of what it is that they're contributing and how they're contributing to the mission of the firm. And if we do that, we engage in practices that lead to an idea that marketers have termed living the brand. This is encouraging people by recognizing that you have these internal constituents to pull towards the same goal in such a way that the firm as a whole adds to the overall better fulfillment of its mission and satisfying its constituents in ways that are more and more productive. And if you get to this point, companies that live the brand, on average, have higher success, higher profitability. If you treat workers merely as means to ends, as transactions, and if you've only focused on these kinds of sort of theory X, rewards and punishments, you don't have employees that are necessarily loyal and living the brand. What's an example of a company that does this really, really well, and as a result, is the only airline that has not gone broke? Southwest Airlines. If you go to Southwest, almost every employee, and I have friends that work for Southwest Airlines, Southwest has not always been the highest paying airline for pilots and flight attendants and AMPs and people that work for them. But overwhelmingly, their employees are very happy, or historically have been. Now, in recent years, they've had some problems as a result, but their employees, on the whole, by and large, in the past at least, have lived the brand. And they've made as a result of that, historically, until they had this sort of failure in their customer relationship management system, they have made what is a sort of a miserable experience. If you've flown recently, which I attempt to not do, I attempt to not get on commercial airlines, but there are times when I have to get on commercial airlines. When I take sales students to competitions, I have to get on because the school won't let me use my own plane. Don't know why. But they won't. Something about liability. God, those lawyers are horrible. That liability issue, lawyers, messing up the world. It's a miserable experience. Of all of, and Southwest, it's a cattle call. It could be a really miserable experience. But for some reason, their customers are pretty happy. You know? I mean, if you're not in the A group, you're not going to sit where you want to sit. And you may not be sitting together. And yet, Southwest customers are pretty loyal. Or at least in the past they have been, as a result of living the brand. And this is one of the reasons why we focus as marketers on the meaning and value of work in an attempt to make our companies places where people want to work. So when you go out into the workforce, how can you help? How can you help your company achieve these goals as a marketer? By recognizing that the liberal model of work says that we need to focus at a minimum on free and autonomous choices. To the extent possible, allowing for places like workplace democracy to occur so that employees feel that they have a say in the company's future. Right? Listening to employees. They actually have sometimes good ideas that we should take into account. And those things are important. Well, I'm out of time. If you got ducks, come see me. And I will see you next Tuesday. Did everybody have a good fall break? We all had a good fall break.
No.
Work. That's what, a lot of us did, work.